The hills of eastern Afghanistan lie beneath a sky that seems to remember every silence it has ever held. Their slopes are bare, washed pale by years of wind, shaped into long, patient curves that catch the dying light like waves frozen mid-motion. When the evening settles, the air begins to hum. Not loud, not sudden, but steady, as though the land itself is breathing through the cracks of its own bones. Locals say the sound has always been there. To them, it is the hills remembering. At dusk, the wind gathers weight. It threads through valleys carved by forgotten hoofprints, moves along dry gullies where rivers once ran, and finds its way through hollow stones that whisper when the air turns cold. Shepherds hear voices in it, old slow syllables that no one alive can quite translate. Some say the tones shift depending on who listens. To a wanderer it sounds like a warning, to a man returning home, like a prayer. Even soldiers posted nearby notice it. They don't speak of ghosts, they speak of patterns. The hum starts at the same hour every night, fades at dawn, then returns again, unchanged. Their equipment picks up nothing, yet the sound lingers in their ears long after they leave their posts. A few admit that on still nights, it almost feels as if the air is pressing closer, like it wants to be heard. And when the moon rises over those ridgelines, silvering the dust and rock, the wind seems to pause, just long enough for the listener to wonder if it's waiting for someone to answer. The commander studied the map under a dim yellow bulb, its edges curled from years of use. Every hill and ravine carried a name, every village a coordinate, except one. A blank space stretched across a narrow ridgeline, where contour lines bunched together like clenched fingers. Old Soviet charts called it Hill 87, but even that label had been crossed out with ink that had faded to rust. No one in the unit spoke the number aloud. When he asked the local guide, the man only smiled and said, "Some places don't want to be known." The words came without superstition, as though it was simply a fact of geography. The commander thought of terrain, of topography, of military logic, but the silence of the guide stayed longer than the explanation. Later, in the outpost, someone found an older map tucked inside an equipment crate. It was drawn by hand, possibly from the British campaign. The same ridge appeared there, shaded darker than the rest. In one corner, a faint note in pencil. "Avoid this rise after dusk. Sound carries too far." The letters seemed hurried, as though written in a moving tent. That night, the commander stepped outside to feel the air for himself. The ridge stood in the distance, a line against the moonlight. The wind there seemed slower, as if hesitating. He listened for gunfire, for animals, for anything, but only heard the faint murmur of the hills, a sound that wasn't quite wind, yet wasn't language either. He folded the map, pressed it flat beneath a rock, and never marked that area again. Some parts of a war, he thought, aren't meant to be charted. They only exist when the wind remembers them. As the sun slipped behind the ridges, the hills changed colour. First bronze, then violet, and finally a deep grey that swallowed every outline. The wind began its nightly passage, sliding low across the sand. At first it came soft, like breath on glass. Then the surface started to move. Ripples formed across the ground, narrow and even, like the ghost of marching feet. One of the soldiers noticed it first. He crouched, running his fingers through the sand, expecting to find a pattern cut by the breeze. But the lines kept shifting, orderly, deliberate, never random. They stretched downhill in rows, parallel and precise, as though the earth was rehearsing a memory. No one spoke. The only sound was the hush of the wind folding around them, a rhythm older than their fear. By nightfall, the ripples had spread toward the base of the ridge, forming the faint impression of movement frozen mid-step. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Even the smallest sound, a boot scuff, a whispered joke, felt wrong, like speaking in a place that was already speaking back. When dawn came, the marks were gone. The sand lay smooth again, untouched except for their own footprints. One soldier joked that the desert had polished itself overnight. No one laughed. As they packed their gear, they realized no one had slept. Every man swore he'd heard something different, a song, a chant, a low murmur beneath the wind, but none could describe it the same way. The commander made no report. He simply marked the morning as clear in his logbook. Yet from that day onward, no one stood on that ridge after sunset. The wind there wasn't just a sound anymore. It had learned to move. Long before soldiers carried radios or marked their routes on digital screens, These same hills had echoed with the clash of steel and the cries of men who fought without maps or mercy. Local histories speak of a battle that lasted 7 days, though some say it could have been 70. No one remembers who won. The ground doesn't either. It only remembers weight, of feet, of blood, of silence afterward. In the village below the ridge, elders tell the story without emotion. They say it was a fight between cousins, between tribes that once shared the same wells and prayer stones. When drought came, anger followed. The battle began with shouts and ended in whispers. For weeks, no birds nested in the area. When the rains returned, they brought bones to the surface. Ribs, spearheads, rings still gripping finger bones turned to dust. The villagers buried what they found, but each season the earth gave something back. Centuries later, a British officer stationed nearby wrote of the same place. His report, buried in an old archive, described the peculiar harmony of wind through hollows that seemed carved by deliberate hands. He didn't call it haunting, he called it acoustics. But in his final notes, smudged with field dust, he wrote one sentence that doesn't fit the rest. At dusk, the hills hum as if thousands breathe beneath them. Archaeologists came decades after and left within weeks. They found fragments of pottery fused to melted iron, signs of heat too intense for the tools of the time. They found no graves, yet the soil tested rich with trace elements of decay. Whatever happened here wasn't a simple battle. It was an ending that refused to end. And every storm that sweeps across this valley still uncovers new evidence, as if the land is reluctant to forget what it saw. In the summer of 1984, a Soviet geological team arrived in the valley under orders to survey mineral veins for possible extraction. They brought machinery, translators, and a level of certainty that comes only from distance, from believing the world will behave according to the tools you carry. For 2 weeks, they drilled into the ridge and found nothing unusual. Then, one morning, a soldier assigned to perimeter duty noticed something impossible. A stone slab, half buried at the base of the hill, had shifted. It was rectangular, carved by hand, its surface covered with faded script. The night before, the men had camped beside it, using it as a table for their maps. Now it stood at an angle, as if the ground had heaved beneath it. The commander ordered the team to record its new position. They took photographs, measurements, and even a plaster cast. By noon, the cast was gone. Blown away, they said, but the wind that day was still. That evening, the camp generator failed. Radios flickered, watches stopped. The interpreter claimed he heard soft knocking from beneath the slab, like pebbles rolling inside hollow stone. The noise lasted only seconds, yet every man in the camp heard it. No one mentioned it again. In the report sent back to Kabul, the event was noted as minor seismic disturbance. Weeks later, when a second team arrived to continue the excavation, they found no trace of the slab. Only a shallow depression remained, packed smooth with dust. Soviet records end there. The final entry reads, "Site cleared, unsuitable for further study." But among local accounts, the memory lingers differently. They say the stone never vanished. It simply returned to where it belonged. Sometimes, after a strong wind, they find the faint outline of a rectangle near the ridge, as if the earth still remembers where it was once touched. The oldest man in the valley sits outside his home each evening, a wool shawl drawn around his shoulders, eyes fixed on the ridge. When asked about the hill, he never tells stories of ghosts or soldiers. He simply repeats what his father told him. Don't answer the wind if it calls you by name. To outsiders, it sounds like folklore. To those who live here, it's advice, quiet, simple, and absolute. He remembers a night long ago when a group of young men climbed the ridge to prove the elders wrong. They laughed, whistled, shouted their names into the dark. The wind answered, softly, almost playfully, mimicking their tones one by one. When the echo came back, one voice was missing. They searched till dawn and found nothing but a single set of footprints leading upward into loose rock that showed no sign of return. The elder speaks slowly when he recalls it. His eyes stay on the ridge. His voice barely rises above the hum of the air. The wind here is old, he says. It knows how to listen, but it doesn't like being spoken to. The soldiers who guard the nearby post sometimes stop by his porch for tea, half smiling at his words. They always promise to be careful. Yet even they notice something strange. During quiet shifts, when the valley holds its breath, it feels as if the air carries a rhythm, like someone speaking far away but meant only for one listener. They turn, find no one, and return to their posts. And though they never admit it, each man wonders what he'd do if the wind ever spoke his name. The new patrol arrived just before dusk, their convoy kicking a thin veil of dust that hung in the air long after the engines stopped. They set up a small observation post on the ridge, where the land folded into a shallow bowl below. The men were quiet, tired from the road, each aware that sound travelled far here. Even laughter seemed to echo too long, as if the air refused to let it go. By midnight, the desert had gone completely still. No insects, no shifting gravel, only the wind moving in slow, deliberate strokes. The radio operator, a young recruit named Hamid, leaned over his set, tuning across frequencies to pass the time. At 01:47 hours, static flared, steady and rhythmic, like breathing through cloth. He adjusted the dial, thinking it was feedback from the generator. But the noise didn't behave like static. It paused, then resumed, repeating in short, precise bursts. Hamid called for his sergeant. Together they listened, faces lit by the dull red glow of the panel. The pattern repeated every 12 seconds, faint but deliberate. It wasn't Morse, nor any known signal, yet something in its structure felt intentional. When they recorded it and slowed the playback, the pauses formed syllables. A linguist at base later claimed the pattern resembled an old dialect of Pashto, one not spoken in 100 years. Outside, the hills were whispering again. The patrol took turns at the watchtower, scanning the valley through nightscopes. Sometimes the lenses flickered with movement, shapes dissolving before focus could settle. By dawn, the transmission had stopped. The radio was silent except for the wind pressing against the walls of the outpost, a steady exhale from the ancient ground below. In the morning log, the sergeant wrote, "Unidentified atmospheric anomaly. No interference detected." But that night, when Hamid lay down to rest, he heard it again, faint, inside his own breathing, the rhythm of a language that didn't belong to him. The next night began without incident. The wind was steady, the sky clear, and the temperature dropped fast, sharp enough that every breath came out white. The patrol sat by the dim red glow of their radios, half listening, half drifting between wakefulness and the quiet rhythm of routine. Then, just after 2 in the morning, the static returned, soft at first, like distant rain, but this time it carried numbers. Hamid froze. The transmission was clean, too structured to be noise. A voice, calm and clipped, recited coordinates in perfect military cadence. Northing, easting, elevation, each digit precise. The sergeant leaned closer, his face unreadable. "Playback," he said, and Hamid rewound the reel. The coordinates matched the center of the whispering hills, the same ridge that no one had ever marked on their maps. The voice continued for another 30 seconds before cutting off mid-word. They replayed it again and again, searching for distortion, accent, anything human. The tone was flat, mechanical, but not synthetic, like a man trained to speak without emotion. Cross-checking the codes revealed something stranger. They were formatted in a Soviet-era encryption style, last used in 1986. "Could be a test signal," someone muttered, though no one believed it. The sergeant stepped outside, scanning the dark slopes below. The wind had died completely. Even the sand seemed to wait. Somewhere out there, between the folds of the hills, the voice had spoken their own language in the discipline of another army. They logged the event, sealed the tape, and sent it to command the following day. The official response came a week later. Signal untraceable, source undetermined, disregard anomaly. But that night, when Hamid checked his equipment, he found a new file automatically saved on his recorder. Its timestamp marked hours before the transmission ever began. When he played it back, the same voice whispered 3 words in Russian, "Мы все здесь." "We are all here." At dawn, the wind rose again, dragging a low hum through the valley. The men packed their gear in silence, each pretending not to notice that the air itself seemed heavier, thicker, as if carrying something unseen. Hamid turned on his recorder out of habit. The reels spun softly, catching fragments of morning static. But beneath it, faint and distant, came voices, not one, but many, layered over each other like overlapping prayers. They spoke in unison, the syllables slow and drawn, echoing through the hum of the machine. For a moment, Hamid thought he recognized the rhythm from the night before. The same pattern, only softer, mournful. He signaled the sergeant, who leaned in close. Together, They listened until the noise dissolved into a steady hiss. When Hamid checked the timer, it read 3 minutes and 20 seconds. He rewound the tape. Nothing. The recording was blank. Not silence, blank. The reel played smooth, uninterrupted, but without a single trace of sound. No static, no wind, no mechanical hiss. It was as if the machine had refused to remember. That afternoon, a message came from base requesting all copies of the previous transmissions. Command called them audio malfunctions, yet the men knew what they had heard. Later, one of the soldiers claimed that during playback, he'd caught a whisper behind him repeating the same prayer. Faint, reverent, impossibly close to his ear. When night fell, the wind returned to its usual tone, calm and endless. The outpost lights flickered once, then steadied. Hamid left the recorder running beside his bunk, the reel turning in the dark. By morning, it had stopped on its own, the tape perfectly full, but still empty. The air changed before the storm came. It wasn't temperature or pressure, it was weight, an unseen density pressing against the lungs. The hills stood unnaturally still, their shadows sharp against a sky turning the color of tarnished brass. The patrol had learned to read weather, but this was something else. The wind stopped altogether, and in the silence that followed, they could hear the dust shifting against itself, like the faint scrape of fabric over stone. By late afternoon, the horizon began to blur. A copper haze thickened in the distance, rolling forward without sound. Someone said it looked like smoke from a burning field, but there was no fire, no smell. Within minutes, the world turned sepia, the kind of light that makes everything appear older, already fading. The radio buzzed once, then went dead. The sergeant ordered the men inside, though the walls offered little comfort. Through narrow slits in the bunker, they watched the haze crawl across the valley floor, swallowing the riverbed, the ridge, and finally the horizon itself. The storm moved like a tide, not swirling, but advancing with the slow, deliberate motion of marching troops. When the first gusts reached them, they carried no sand, only a dry, rhythmic pulse that seemed to vibrate in the chest more than in the ears. Someone whispered that it sounded like footsteps. Another swore he saw figures forming within the haze, not shadows but outlines, human, shoulder to shoulder, walking in perfect silence. No one spoke after that. The world outside had vanished into a single color, and every man inside the outpost could feel the same thought forming in his mind, that the storm wasn't moving through the valley at all. It was returning to it. The storm reached them just after dusk. It didn't roar or strike. It arrived like a tide of silence, folding itself around the outpost until the world outside ceased to exist. The air turned amber and thick, swallowing the last traces of daylight. Inside, flashlights flickered weakly, their beams bending in the suspended dust. The men spoke little, their voices muffled, each word falling flat as if sound itself had lost its direction. Then, from somewhere within that stillness, came a tone, low at first, barely audible, then rising into a clear, sustained note that vibrated through the metal walls. It wasn't mechanical, it was organic, almost ceremonial, like the call of a distant horn. The radio operator checked his channels, but every frequency bled with the same single pitch. Outside, through the narrow viewing slit, the dust began to shape itself. Figures moved within it, hundreds, maybe more. They weren't formed enough to see faces, only the outlines of helmets, shoulders, and weapons held close to the body. They marched in silence, the storm bending around them as if it obeyed their rhythm. The horn sounded again, this time closer, vibrating the ground beneath the men's boots. The sergeant gripped the table, whispering that it was impossible. No storm carried sound like that. For 30 seconds, everything aligned, the radio, the horn, the moving haze, all pulsing in perfect synchronization. The patrol watched through slits of light as the valley seemed to reassemble itself into another time, another battle. And just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The horn faded. The dust fell still. Outside, the air cleared by degrees. No footprints, no wind. Only a faint warmth clung to the ground, as if hundreds had just passed. The hills, for the first time in weeks, were utterly quiet. When morning came, the world looked scrubbed clean. The storm had left behind a pale brightness that didn't belong to sunlight. The air felt hollow, emptied of its usual weight, and the horizon shimmered with heat that wasn't there. The men stepped outside in silence. Where the valley had been, new dunes rose and fell like waves caught mid-motion, fresh sand, smooth and untouched. Hamid was the first to notice the shapes. From the ridge, the dunes formed perfect mounds, arranged in careful rows, each one the same size, the same distance apart. At first, they looked like the remnants of wind patterns, but something about the symmetry felt deliberate, almost respectful. The patrol approached cautiously, boots sinking in soft dust. The ground was warm beneath their soles. The sergeant took a photograph of the field before the wind could shift again. He counted 11 mounds, then 12, each one casting a short shadow that pointed east. When he turned to speak, his words caught. Footprints, dozens of them, spread outward from the dunes, leading in every direction, their impressions crisp, unblurred, as if pressed moments ago. Yet there were none returning. By afternoon, the light had softened. The mounds began to dissolve, their edges sliding back into the flatness of the valley. Within an hour they were gone. The footprints followed, fading grain by grain until nothing remained but smooth sand and a faint memory of warmth underfoot. That night, as they reviewed the photographs, the sergeant noticed something he hadn't seen before. A faint line of shapes on the farthest ridge, aligned shoulder to shoulder in the dying light. He zoomed in until the image blurred. Whether it was dust or something standing still, no one could say. Days later, when the dust finally settled, a research team arrived from the provincial capital. Their task was simple: document the aftermath of the storm and verify the patrol's reports. The soldiers led them to the ridge where the dunes had appeared. The valley looked ordinary again, quiet, stripped of its strange geometry. But as the archaeologists began to dig, the earth gave up its first secret. A fragment of bone emerged from the sand, bleached white and clean as porcelain. Then another. Within hours, the team uncovered a shallow trench packed with skeletons. They were intertwined, bodies locked together in the posture of combat, some clutching rusted rifles, others the curved blades of an older age. The weapons had fused to the bone, corroded into a single mass of metal and memory. There were no uniforms left, only scraps of cloth indistinguishable by color. The scientists spoke in clipped tones, each trying to sound detached. Yet the silence between their words carried a reverence that none of them could explain. When the forensic specialist brushed away the last of the sand, he noticed something unusual. Every face was turned east, toward the sunrise. Even the skulls, fractured and weathered, seemed aligned by deliberate hands. The sergeant who had witnessed the storm stood apart, watching the excavation unfold. The same wind that once whispered now moved softly through the valley, stirring the dust but carrying no voice. He lit a cigarette, his hands steady, his eyes distant. "They were waiting," he murmured. No one asked what he meant. By evening, the researchers covered the site again. The bones were too fragile to move, too sacred to leave exposed. The final entry in their field report read, "Remains of mixed origin, likely both Afghan and foreign. Evidence suggests they died together, not apart." As dusk fell, the patrol packed their equipment. The wind rose once more. Only this time, it carried no hum, no echo, just a quiet exhale, as if the land itself was finally resting. In the days that followed the excavation, the valley grew unnaturally calm. The air, once full of faint murmurs, felt empty, too still to be natural. The wind no longer crossed the ridges with its old breathing rhythm. The soldiers noticed it first. Nights that used to hum now hung in silence so complete that every heartbeat seemed louder than it should. They told themselves it was peace, but it didn't feel like it. The locals arrived soon after, guided by rumor and reverence. Men in worn turbans, children clutching water flasks, women carrying incense bowls. They climbed the slope in single file, stopping at the place where the bones had been unearthed. A prayer was recited, not loud, not mournful, just soft enough to blend with the faint rustle of dust. The sergeant stood beside them, cap in hand, unsure whether he was witnessing a burial or a release. By dusk, they covered the site with small stones, one for each mound that had appeared during the storm. The villagers called it khaamosh pahaar, the silent hill. They said the land had been waiting for someone to remember it properly, and now that it had been acknowledged, it could finally sleep. That night, the patrol remained awake out of habit, yet nothing stirred. The wind did not rise. Radios stayed quiet. Even the sand seemed heavier, anchored. Some of the men admitted they missed the sound, the strange comfort of those whispers that had followed them for weeks. The absence felt louder than the noise ever had. Before dawn, Hamid stood outside, listening to the stillness. The stars above the ridge flickered faintly, untouched by cloud or dust. He whispered something to the darkness, he didn't know what, and waited. The air stayed calm, unmoved, and for the first time he understood. The whispers had never been a warning. They had been a memory, asking to be heard one last time. Now, at last, the hills could rest, and so could he. A week after the valley fell silent, the outpost prepared to relocate. The equipment was packed, the logs archived, the radios powered down. On the final night, Hamid sat alone at the console, staring at the blank dials that once carried voices. Out of habit, he pressed record and let the reel turn. For hours, it caught nothing but the soft hum of electricity. Then, just before dawn, a whisper came through, thin, distant, and unmistakably human. It spoke in Pashto, slow and measured, the syllables fragile as dust. Zma Sara Ye. We are still here. The voice faded before he could respond. The reel stopped on its own, tape stretched to the end. When Hamid played it back, the words were gone, replaced by a single breath, barely audible, but real. He smiled, rewound the tape and left it on the console. When the unit departed at sunrise, the hills remained quiet. The wind moved gently across the valley, touching every ridge as though in farewell. For a brief moment, it carried a faint vibration, neither sound nor echo, just the impression of presence. Then it vanished, leaving only silence, and a story the land would keep forever.